All right, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. I'm going to give you a little summary of how we're going to run this. It will be a conversation. It's not highly structured. We're going to have a talk about where these brilliant panelists see the web in 2035. We've got 4 general questions, and we're going to spend some time on those. We're going to leave time for question and answers from you all, the audience, at the end. And that's the general structure of how this is going to go. So let's take a minute and let everybody introduce themselves. We will start with Ondřej.
Hello, my name is Ondřej Mirtes, and I like pointing out mistakes in other people's code so much that I create PHPStan. And I would like to ask, who is a PHP developer in the audience, and who uses PHPStan? Yeah, that always makes me happy to see. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sachiko, giving a more conventional intro, I think. I wear several hats. I'm, first of all, proud to be a board member of the Drupal Association since almost a year. This is my second DrupalCon. I missed the Barcelona one, but enjoyed meeting a lot of people, excited Drupal enthusiasts in Atlanta. I also am the chair and former CEO of an organization called Open Forum Europe, a Brussels-based think tank promoting open technologies. And in my day job, I'm a senior researcher at a state-owned research institute in Sweden. So I'm hoping to bring this sort of social science and public policy perspective to this discussion.
Hi, I'm Sebastian. I'm doing PHP since 1998, and 25 years ago I started to work on this thing called PHPUnit. It also always makes me happy to see that people are using my software, so that's very close to what Ondřej is doing. So who is using PHPUnit? That's nice to see, thank you so much. I'm also aware of many hats, so I'm not just here because I do PHPUnit. I'm also here, I think at least, because I'm one of the board members for the PHP Foundation. So we try to shape the future of PHP and fund developers working on PHP, the language. And because GitHub stars don't put food on the table or a roof over my head, I also work as a consultant, coach, and trainer and help development teams build better software.
Hi, I'm Derick. I've also been on the internet for at least most of this century, if not more. I started making Xdebug about 2002. This is also my second DrupalCon, but the first one was in 2006 in Munich, so it's a while ago. It's good to see so many of you still here today. That's what I have to say. Let's get on with this.
Thank you. Thank you. Sebastian, I'm going to hit you with the first question. And it's... open source has been a driving force in web development. How do you envision its role evolving by 2035? And let's put some focus here on innovation, collaboration, digital sovereignty. I mean, answer it however you want, but those are the big ones. Mm-hmm. Right?
So I'm trying something today that is totally out of character for me. I want to be really positive. Because just like Ondřej mentioned, he likes pointing out mistakes in other people's code. So to some degree, that is also what my tools do. Or I want to avoid mistakes and want to help developers avoid them. So I would like to try painting a positive picture. So I think within the next 10 years, we will see more initiatives like the Sovereign Tech Fund from the Sovereign Tech Agency in Germany. I think Europe has by then hopefully figured out there are some positive signs that this is happening already, that it is important to focus on things like digital sovereignty and that open source can help with that. And I think on the society level, I think within the next 10 years, or I hope that within the next 10 years, we have realized how crucial open source is, and that more and more market actors put the money where their mouth is. Mm-hmm. And not just talk about, oh, it's awesome that all these free components are on the net and I can build software based on that and create value, but that we realize as a society as a whole, or within our profession at least, that working on, especially on infrastructure components like programming languages with PHP, development tools like PHPStan and PHPUnit, this is work. And people need to have the freedom to do this work, and at some point this requires payment. So somehow this funding needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that we've always had. I remember the graphic that comes up quite often with the looks like building blocks, and then at the very bottom of it, there's the one, and that's the one person who's taking care of that library. Do you all feel like funding is getting better? Do you feel like that is happening?
You probably specifically refer to the XKCD comic with this little block. I call him Daniel Stenberg. He's the developer of curl, and you might have heard of this library or not, but I can assure you, all of you have used this multiple times today. It's the foundations of some software projects that are not always so easy to see that they actually exist. And as maintainer of this software, and I see that with the PHP project maybe to a lesser extent, there are so many big corporations that make use of the software, but the moment that there's a bug, they don't want to put up any help. And what help means here is no funding, not even engineer time to sometimes even look into these bugs. And I think that is a bit of a sad thing, and I think that is where things like the Sovereign Tech Agency are actually really important as well. There's an organization in the Netherlands called NLNet, probably heard of it if you're from there, that specifically also creates these grants projects, not necessarily for open source projects as a wild thing, but more specifically for the more social aspects of the open web specifically, providing grants towards Mastodon and things like that. And with the STA in Germany and NLNet in the Netherlands, I really hope that more countries will follow that. That might exist, but I'm not just aware of that right now.
I was going to cover these themes. I thought you would be sort of focusing more on the technological innovation aspects, but I can maybe add something to that. I've been sort of in this public policy and open source space since 2007, and there was a public sector interest in open source, in the wake of the global financial crisis, but that was mainly cost-driven, and it was fairly limited. It was sort of based on should we use Google Docs instead of Microsoft Office, and it was so sort of a limited choice, and once economies were recovering, the interest waned, and I think that what I'm seeing now in the last couple of years at the European level, and also globally, I think we shouldn't just focus on Europe, but although I think a lot of it is happening in Europe, I think that there is, for the first time, maybe really a political interest in open source that might actually move the needle in terms of public procurement decisions, etc. So that's a great opportunity, I think, for Drupal. I've had a lot of discussions around that in the last few days, and I think that I hope we can take full advantage of that opportunity in Europe and also in other markets. I'm involved in something called the UN Open Source Week, which was organized this year, and it's sort of the third year in a row we've organized this at the UN headquarters in New York, and it's interesting to see the interest in digital public infrastructure. Which I think should be a concept that is firmly based on open source. The interest in that, and it's not just, it's a wider interest. It also comes from this notion of a trust crisis. So it's not only about having digital sovereignty as opposed to being sort of dependent on proprietary technology from non-European companies, but really also this need to build trust in governments and in what solutions they are providing in order to create trust or build trust in government services, etc. So mentioned already the Sovereign Tech Agency. My organization, actually Open Forum Europe, we recently published a report calling for an EU-wide Sovereign Tech Agency. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about this later. I think that funding and grants, there are lots of upcoming opportunities on that front, but I think we should also be looking at public procurement. And there is, again, upcoming legislation, revision of the Public Procurement Directive, possibility to give a preference not just to open source, but to sustainable open source. And so, yeah, many opportunities around open source.
So this increase in political will, do you feel like this is coming from the place of the trust crisis? Or do you think that there are more significant factors in play?
So maybe there's not just one trust crisis. I think I just alluded to the... So there's one, can we trust American technologies? Can we trust the US administration? I mean, that's the kind of trust from the European perspective. But what I was referring to was actually, I had on a panel at the UN, somebody representing the government OSPO in South Africa. And there they were talking more about sort of this trust towards government and in general. And so you see that also in other places. And I think that that's something that we are maybe not, that's not top of mind in Europe. I think there's still, even though there's a kind of eroding trust in institutions, we have some, I think, basic trust in public institutions still there, which does not exist in some other countries. And that really slows down uptake of technology. So open source is there to provide sort of an added layer of trust.
We saw some of that during the pandemic, I think, where lots of governments, at least in the UK where I live, were trying to make their own contact tracing apps. And of course, that didn't really work very well. And we see it now more recently where the UK government is trying to introduce ID cards. I realize that if you're from a European country, all of you will have an ID card already. But this is just not a thing in the UK. And the UK population is really against this. If you look at how these things can be used properly, like giving better and quicker access to services without you having to show up with a driver's license, a utility bill. I know that sounds really weird to non-UK people here, but it makes no sense, right? And they now have this plan to introduce these digital ID cards. And that is not going to go well. And although I'm not technically against digital ID cards, I am not in favor of it, like with how a UK government approaches these things, because as you say, there's no trust on whether they will do anything of this right and correct, and not all of people's data gets stolen. And I don't say that as a possibility. Recently, the UK requires age verification for, I can't probably even define what it is for because the legislation is so complicated, which means that if you want to access certain things on Discord, you need to prove that you're over 18 years old. Now, that means that Discord needs to prove that you're that old, and they obviously don't want you to upload your passports to them, so they've contracted that to a third party's service. But there's no regulation of who's qualified to be able to do so. This was a problem when this went through Parliament, but now this legislation has been enforced for half a year. Already 3 million passports has been stolen because of Discord's third-party service. So you can see that a lot needs to be done, not only on the trust side, on us trusting the government to do things right, but also how do you verify that you can trust third parties with any of this data?
Ondřej?
I want to get back a little bit to open source and iterate over what Sebastian said, and you also said, that companies are not aware of what open source they are using, and decision makers who decide where the money goes don't know what software is their company using, and it can manifest in like when a package, open source package goes away or something gets broken in there, their software also gets broken, right? So what I hope to happen in 10 years is that companies are aware of what software, open source software are they using, and make decisions on that. So they can either decide that they want to use some package made by a single person somewhere in Nebraska holding the entire internet together, or they can decide not to, but when they decide that they want to use this package, they should make sure that they support it. I'm very lucky in that PHPStan, I'm able to work on PHPStan as my full-time job, thanks to generous GitHub sponsors and subscribers to PHPStan Pro, but not everyone is lucky in that way. And I hope that in 10 years that changes with maybe some new regulations or legislations that maybe make use of standards like a software bill of materials that makes sure that when you use some software build, you also know everything, all the packages, all the code that it contains.
Yeah, go ahead.
I had not expected that everybody would be talking about policy here. So hope that's okay with the audience. So to some extent, that's going to happen anyway, right? We are entering a sort of a regulatory era of software, and since majority of software, contains open source software, this is coming. And my concern is that to some extent, you see these figures of 96% of software stacks contain open source and all of that. And a lot of that has happened indeed without decision makers understanding that that's the case. You see what I mean? And I am concerned always with every new regulation, with every new change, that there's going to be used by proprietary vendors to also spread FUD around open source. So this is why I think it's really important that the open source communities are aware and are, developing software, following, best practice, etc. I just don't want this to become an argument for not using open source.
I just want to attempt to make it less surprising that the three of us here are interested in policy, and 10 years ago I would have not been interested in that, or not at least as much as I should have, but regulations, standards, policy, laws, all of that is code. And we know a thing or two about code, and as soon as it starts to affect us in what we do more and more, we nerd ourselves into that. I mean, even the word code, you can trace that at least back as far as the Codex Hammurabi, and that was the first code of law that we have that is still around in written. And so to me, that is... A while ago, it would not have been obvious, but by now it's obvious. And I feel like I have to do this because it's important to all of us.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you mentioned standards, and we continue this conversation. It segues very nicely into the next question, which is like, how do we see standards evolving between now and 2035? And standards here, whatever that word means to you, because Sachiko, I think standards for you is going to mean something different than it does maybe for Ondřej and the other gentleman on the stage. But how do we see standards progressing and evolving?
Yeah, I think, again, that's something that open source communities are not going to be able to ignore. And I'm not saying that you have, but we're talking about regulation. And for some of these regulations that have come out from the EU, for example, the code, or if you will, the legal text will not describe precisely how something will be implemented. But in the European context, we have something called implementing standards. So you have formal standards actually specifying what it means. You might have a toy safety directive, and it says, well, we have this legislation to stop toys that can be swallowed and kids can choke on them. We need to stop that, and we need to make toys safe. And so then that's in the legal text. And then, the legislator will turn around to standards organizations where you have industry representation to actually understand and translate that intention into something that can be, where you can follow a specification and then show that you are actually making toys that are safe for the European market. Now that's happening now also for software. So it's not just the Cyber Resilience Act, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. There is the AI Act, and I'm sure this is also going to happen elsewhere as well. And there, it's important to understand how it's going to. The legislation initially might be formulated for a kind of traditional scenario of a manufacturer, having a product, and now there's a digital component to it, and which is traditionally maybe developed in-house or whatever. And so, just saying that, in terms of the software, open source communities need to be find a way to involve in some of these standards, because it's not just the legal text, it's the specific way in which those standards are formulated. And so we will have to find a way to organize to involve in those processes.
What do you think a way for these organizations could be? Like, I'm sure the Drupal organization or the PHP Foundation or the Python Foundation or any of these foundations, coming back to Sebastian's point, not everybody thinks that policy is important, but it is really important, as, well, pretty much all of us have just mentioned. But how do you think that these organizations, if they feel like they can be part of this, how can they insert themselves into that process? Because I don't think that's always that easy to do.
It's not for smaller projects, because I think, what we've seen with the CRA is that some of the larger foundations, they have engaged in this process and are recognized in the legislation and also as a stakeholder. So open source foundations, have been given this steward label, and are mentioned also that they should be consulted in the standardization process. So there is a space for that to happen. The problem is that as I'm getting to know Drupal, for example, I realize that the way that the Drupal ecosystem works, in terms of how the technology is developed and the role of agencies, etc., this might be different, and the business models are different compared to other open source technologies, which means that you'll have to figure out what it means specifically for the setup of Drupal and how Drupal functions and the wider ecosystem. And there, I think it's not enough to rely on Eclipse and LF to kind of figure that out for how it works.
Because the obvious next question is, how do regulatory organizations get these people on board as well, right? I have no answer, but
to show up.
Yeah, you have to show up. Yeah.
I think it's an interesting.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
When you mentioned standards, I had something totally different in mind.
Yeah, I figured. Yeah.
Because this is about the Web 2035, I was thinking, what happens to web standards? And that is a very broad term to begin with, right? Because we have our HTTP and HTTP 2 and 3, and maybe in 2035 we have HTTP 4, 5, and 6. Who knows how fast that goes?
I'd like for us to spend some time on that. Sure, yeah. So
okay, I'll go straight ahead. Yeah. Was that a segue? So there's one of the standards that you probably all have heard of is email, right? Everybody sends email, hopefully. Nobody really likes it. Or at least I don't quite like receiving most of those. But email is, as its underlying standard for sending email around, is SMTP. It's been around for 30, 40, I can't even remember how long ago. But the standard was always focused on groups of people sending email to other groups of people. And by groups of people, originally universities, and then maybe companies or government organizations, right? But if I ask you here now, how many of you use Gmail as an email service? Just show of hand. That's, well, I'm going to say 50%, right? And it's probably more if you go beyond all the nerds that we are. I say that as a nice way. it changes the concept of standards that can be implemented by everybody. Everybody has a concern about, everybody can put this forward. What it has turned into is a standard basically changed, not even in standard form, but by using it and demanding extra rules on top of this for email to get even delivered. I'm talking about Gmail here, I'm talking about Outlook. The really big companies can now dedicate how these standards work. I operate a PHP mailing list, and we have so much problems getting email even delivered to Gmail. There shouldn't really be a need, but they add all these extra requirements that are sort of standard, but it is not what the original SMTP standard was built on top of, right? It was there so that groups of people with their own email server can send emails to another email server as a very much decentralized way. So some of the standards that we have are starting to erode into standards owned by corporations. And I think we need to be really careful with that. This also happens when you go to a website for a company and said, oh, it's on Facebook. It's the same thing, like that. Everybody can set up their own web server with their own website, hopefully with Drupal if you're here, I suppose. But I'm sure there's some WordPress holders out as well. And that standard is also disappearing because everything goes beyond these big boxes. So now, what can we do around that? What can we change there? Your social media, do you want that to be centralized by a certain organization? Or the way how you distribute news articles? Do you only want the news articles by your government being sent on Twitter or on Facebook? That is not an open way of doing it. And I think we need to figure out a way how we as web engineers, broad term, get back to what the original protocols of the web, the original standards were meant to do. Groups of people being able to interact with other groups of people.
There is one medium that's currently being used by a lot of people, and it's still decentralized, which can be said, for example, about video on the web, which is owned by YouTube, but there is one medium that a lot of people use, and that's podcasts. Podcasts are built on an open standard. They are built on RSS, and if you are using podcast player today, you are using open standards, and podcasts are decentralized, which I think it's a really awesome thing. Of course, some companies are trying to change that and just have podcast universe for themselves, for example, Spotify. But I think that we can still fight against it and keep podcasts open because they are better that way. When it comes to standards, I think that when you say standard, something different pops up in everyone's head. And for me, it's standards for building websites, web applications, so browser standards, HTML standards, CSS standards. And what I don't like about today's web, besides like the centralization, is that a lot of websites are single-page applications, and every single-page application is basically a custom browser running inside a browser. So if you are working on a single-page application, you need to re-implement a lot of things that you would get for free if you just written plain HTML. So for example, as a developer of a single-page application, you need to remember all the things that the browser does for you. So for example, when the user presses escape, it means that they want to stop loading the current website. You need to make sure that the right click on a link still works. You need to make sure that control click or command click always opens a new tab and it works. So I don't know if it's some kind of regulation or anything, but in the Czech Republic, internet banking websites don't work if you open them in multiple tabs. If I try to open a second tab of my internet banking, it locks me out, which is really annoying. So what I would like to see is web standards evolving and taking care of the needs of developers and users and customers, so that single-page applications become kind of more irrelevant. So because I want to see more standards enabling the behavior that you currently have to write a lot of custom JavaScript or use technologies like React, so that you can take advantage of the things that the browser already implements for you. And I think that we can already see some movement in this area. So for example, CSS page transitions is currently in draft, and it tries to allow developers to use custom animations, custom transitions when the user clicks on a link and goes between pages, which is something that today you have to write some JavaScript code in order to do this. So I would like to get back to the nature that HTML is, which is it's more declarative, and I want to just write declarative HTML attributes and CSS properties to be able to get the behavior that today I have to write some JavaScript for.
We had a conversation, I remember, a few weeks ago where you said you hope that in 2035 the web looks more like it did in 2005. Is this related?
Yeah, so I also had today I had a conversation in the hallway with someone, and he told me that he's a full stack developer. And I told him that 15 years ago, we just called it a developer, not a full stack developer. Because we used to do everything, right? Like I used to get a PSD file and I was able to like produce HTML out of that. Then I was able to make it a little bit more dynamic with PHP. And I hope that we kind of turn down the complexity a little bit and give the power back to the developers to be able to do it all themselves again.
Thank you. Sebastian, I see you ready to go.
Yeah, there's not that much for me to add, but as was already mentioned, standards is such an overloaded term, or at least is a term that has so many different meanings in different contexts. So one thing that was not mentioned yet, I think, is that standards facilitate collaboration. And I hope that in the next 10 years, standards evolve and are strengthened in a way that they make lock-in increasingly, maybe not impossible, but increasingly harder, making it awkward to choose something that locks me into something and steers people towards more open standards, more collaborative, more inclusive things. And I hope that, and like a completely different way of looking at standard is an evolutionary step when it comes to practices. Like somebody starts doing something in a certain way, then suddenly his peers and their peers and so on start doing it as well, and then it's turning into a best practice. And at some point, if enough people, if you reach a critical mass within a profession or a community that everyone is doing that, then you call that a standard. And it becomes increasingly unacceptable to not follow the standard. Yeah, 20 years ago, it was totally normal to not use a tool like PHPStan in your PHP project. It was totally normal to not write tests for your software. These days, it's getting increasingly rare that these tools are not used. And at some point, more and more people will call it unprofessional if tools like that, if practices like these are not used in the project. And I would like to see things like secure by design, privacy, those kinds of aspects baked into maybe the standards that we have or into new ones, and that in 10 years' time it will be normal that we have privacy-friendly and secure applications that everyone can use, and not more and more walled gardens and islands that are ruled by the emperor of that island.
Wait,
Actually,
yeah.
I had signaled, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sebastian. No, I was going to say I actually like, well, I wouldn't say I love emails, but I think it's sometimes better than the alternative, or the alternatives. So I think, but it's true what you're saying. I think that we used to actually refer to email as an example of an interoperability standard that actually functioned. The fact that you could have your own client, a separate client, and you could actually read email sent from, by somebody using a different client, which, for document formats and things like that was not at all possible back in 2008 when I was involved in some kind of standards war on document formats. But just hearing this conversation on standards, there's an ongoing discussion right now in Brussels also because there is an upcoming revision of the regulation on standards, Regulation 1025. And in the broader open source community, you often hear criticism against the formal standardization process in Brussels, or not in Brussels, in the EU, because it is, it's slow moving, it requires a different type of engagement at the member state level, etc., and that it's difficult maybe to access as a sort of individual or a smaller project or something like that. But at the same time, the argument against sort of adopting more agile or faster processes is that it also opens up for some of this sort of single vendor standards, or or also many competing standards, of course. So I think there is this kind of, there's a tension between that. How do we develop market relevant standards that that are open to and maybe using less formal processes, but also at the same time ensuring that you have proper representation and it's not just driven by one large actor or something like this.
I'm not necessarily replying directly to what you were saying. I'd like to go back one step further, if that's okay. But you were talking about email as a operability protocol, is probably the better word for it. And Sebastian mentioned the walled gardens, and Ondřej mentioned RSS. There is actually standards that are sort of built on top of all of these things. There's, I wouldn't say new protocol, it's ActivityPub, which builds on top of RSS. It's specifically there to be interoperable. Such a hard word to say, isn't it? Interoperable, no, I can't do it. Interop, I'll shorten, that's easier. Not even between, say, just a specific thing like publishing images or video, but it can actually do interop between different types of content as well. And that being all decentralized. So that this is something I think is a really interesting protocol that basically builds all these, ties all of these things together. And I think we'll see a lot more of that in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's the tension that you mentioned, I think is critical for us to wrap our heads around, and you touched on it as well, Derick. And it's this idea that a lot of standards come into place organically or naturally based on what we, all of us in this room, are using, right? You ask how many people are using Gmail, almost everybody raised their hands. So yes, that single actor is going to have more of a say on what standards are in place for that. But the question I have for you all is more of an applied question here. Like, so if we acknowledge that that's the case, if we acknowledge that this is the world that we live in, then what can we do in this room, whether we're talking about just like things that we're considering ethically as organizations or as individual developers? What can we consider or keep in mind, or what can we act on? How can we ensure, or at least help to ensure, that the people who are setting the standards have our best interests at heart and are not the Facebooks, the Google, well, I guess I should say Meta and Alphabet, whatever. But how do we do that? What should we keep in mind? What ethical considerations should we have? What action should we take?
It's more than one question, isn't it, really?
I know.
It's like three in one. That makes it harder to answer. To get involved with these things, you need to be part of a larger organization. That is a professional organization, Drupal organization, the Linux Foundation, maybe not the best example, but maybe also look at unions that you have in each country for specific professions. I know I have one. I joined a union. I'm self-employed. That never made any sense to me. But I've recently been on their Discord, and they talk about all this kind of things. They talk about policy, and not necessarily about getting the best rates and getting paid on time, which are also important things, obviously, but the policy aspects of these things. And I think by being active in these organizations, you can also push forward on making it better for you, the users of these things, and not just the big corporations. They will also be involved, obviously, but if you're interested in making sure that in 10 years we still have an open web, you have to put some time in it. And that sounds annoying, and it is less fun than writing code or designing pages or relearning how CSS works, which I had to do recently because it's a lot more interesting now than it was 10 years ago. But that is an important thing, right? It's like you need to get involved with these things, and that might not be a very nice message to her, but it is so important. Coming back to the ethical things, there's things, so besides running Xdebug, I also have a software product on the side called Xdebug Cloud. You can hear about it later. But when I design this, I think about which things I want to have in there. Do I want trackers in there for analytics? There's no need for me to have it in there, right? There's also information I don't really want to keep. Do I want to necessarily know where people live? I don't want to know that. And although you need it for invoicing, but do I want to expose the location information for my users with third parties? For example, should I try to guess from the IP addresses to auto pre-fill in the box in which country they live, for example? Is that something that is important for me to do and such a benefit for users to give them the extra risk of that information to be exposed? An IP address is probably not the most interesting thing here, but as I mentioned earlier, doing age verification where you have to upload ID cards to a random vendor, is this something that you want to do? Do you really need to keep all the data that you might want to use later to make decisions about? I know organizations that basically collects so much data, basically everywhere where your mouse pointer goes on the screen. Is this data that you really need? And I don't mean need as what the advertising companies do with legitimate concern, because none of that is legitimate, right? Well, maybe one or two exceptions, but our 970 parts really feel for your privacy. It's just obviously nonsense. And I have nothing against these regulations that are made by the EU and followed by the UK. But I also think the enforcement part of these things needs to be ramped up much more than they are. And that isn't so easy at the moment.
Well, I mean, you touch on an interesting issue, because it's interesting for me as a political scientist to engage with open source people who are interested in policy, because they need to be, okay? Because I think sometimes during the CRA, for example, I met people and said, but if this is implemented, this is going to, kill open source, And I was like, well, but the policymaker has an intent. That doesn't mean that it's going to run a program which automatically starts to, monitor 100% of what's going on in the market and then generating fines or, sending people to prison or whatever. That's not how implementation works, right? It's not, so, if you had really this sort of, you look at it, approach it like from an engineering point of view, and you see there's a flaw in the legislation, you think that, we're doomed because this is going to be somehow 100% perfectly implemented. This doesn't happen, right? In a way, it's always going to be a muddling through and tested in court and a few things like this. So, but just getting back to your question, because this thing about standards and who are making them and for who. This is it's not an easy question to solve, because standards, those big companies are also employing a lot of they have the expertise, and we need the expertise, the technical expertise, to make high quality standards. And so I sometimes think we need more more engineers employed in the public sector. We cannot legislators at least should be able to participate, maybe not direct the standards work, but participate and understand what is in the public sector, in public interest, let's say. But I think it's not an easy one to solve completely, because we cannot rely also on sort of standards work is sustained engagement, right? So who is going to be able to engage and deploy resources, for not just a couple of months or whatever, but it's processes that take years, and probably you have to be represented in many boards, steering, technical committees where maybe nothing happens for a long time, but it's about building positions in those processes, etc. So it's not for everybody.
Yeah, and I guess, of course it never ends. It's always changing. And I think as it has been talked about here numerous times, we're in a little bit of a chaotic moment. We've got some storms ahead of us. And I think there are a lot of things that we're unsure of. And I don't know about other people in this room, but I know for me, it can keep me from acting. It can keep me from making an active choice to engage with something because I don't know what even my options are. But Sebastian.
Just wanted to quickly come back to what Derick said, because as a German, I have to mention that in our language, we have a term for what he was describing. That's called Datensparsamkeit, which is loosely translated to data frugality. So do not collect data that you do not really have a use case for. Or, like from my personal experience, I would have loved to start collecting analytics in PHPUnit a long time ago. Would have made my life a lot easier to decide, are people actually using a certain feature that is problematic and keeps getting in the way of implementing other things or fixing other bugs. But of course, I don't do that because it would be a privacy nightmare to collect this data and analyze that. And try as I might, I could never completely do this in an anonymous fashion. But jokes aside, with the German language, Datensparsamkeit, no, there will not be a test. You do not need to pronounce it correctly. I am a computer scientist coming from Germany. I'm a member of the German Computer Science Association, the GI, the Gesellschaft für Informatik, which has ethical guidelines for computer scientists and software developers on their website. Can highly recommend giving that a read as a developer. I certainly find that very inspiring. And of course, I'm also a member of the Chaos Computer Club, the CCC, and they also have ethics document published for what we should do as hackers, whatever that term may mean to you. But we talk mostly about open source software and code, and open source code can be audited. And I would like to see our society in 10 years' time demand the same thing from platforms and services that are built using that open source software. Because black boxes erode trust and create liabilities. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
I think.
And if there's one thing we cannot afford, it's losing even more trust in our governments and institutions.
So now I forgot what I wanted to say. No, I'm kidding. You were talking about the data collection and making sure that the systems that are being built right now, often on open source or maybe on copied data of the internet, to say it in a polite form, that these systems that are being built right now will also be auditable. And that, I think, ties very much into things like large language models at the moment, or any basically trained AI model, because you don't know what they do. You cannot know what they do. It is not logical. It is statistics, right? And it's not deterministic, yes, even that. And all these things are trained on open information, but not necessarily following either copyright or license or anything like that. So whenever I see, we're wanting AI to this software, and sorry, I have to be critical. There's quite a few of that content here on this conference, and many others, right? I always think like, where have they stolen that data from that authors, programmers, artists didn't get paid for now? Like, I cringe every time I see an AI-generated image because it's not art. There's no emotion created behind it. It's a computer that applies statistics. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself to our last question, but this is not something that I want to see continuing over the next 10 years, because we end up in a situation where no art gets created, no junior software engineers learn how to code, and how do you then turn into a senior programmer, right? I mean, I'm not saying that some of this technology isn't really useful and can help with things, but it can't end up in a sustainable way of going forward. For writing text, creating art, writing code, which some people, including myself, probably also say is a form of art. And then at the same time, it also should be audited and open so that we can actually see what these things do.
I just want to point out that the AI companies and the large language models are going to have a problem, because today what often happens is the AI hallucinates something, it gets published on the internet, and the next time the new model gets trained on the data, it's going to treat it as a fact, which is going to be a problem, and the models are going to be even more hallucinating and less precise over time.
And that is just talking about what happens to the large language models. Let's not even talk about the financials involved right now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was having a conversation earlier with some friends, Sachiko, you were there, we were talking about collapse and what happens as the models train on data that they've generated. But I think the point that you made is valid. We're talking about how organizations can approach things ethically. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but what I'm hearing from you is that maybe they should rethink, or if they haven't already started this, think clearly about whether they're going to support, encourage, require their employees to use AI, large language models within their work. Like that's a hard action that organizations can take, right? Immediately.
It's happening.
Yeah.
It's already happened. It's too late about doing anything about that, right?
Yes. Well, this does go into our last question. You're right. No, it's good. I'll let you start, right? So the final question was, are there any bold predictions? Just regale us with your bold prediction for what the web in 2035 is going to look like.
Okay, I'm going to give you an option. So there's one variant, where in 10 years, we all still, the web developers, we write our software, we use open source software. The maintainers of this open source software get compensated for this. We'll let you decide what that means. Government organizations have made all the decision creating tools, auditable. We interact with each other through open protocols, maybe still email, hopefully ActivityPub, because I see a big future in that. We get to collaborate with everybody and everybody is happy. Or the alternative is where everything on the internet is owned by the Googles, the Alphabets, the Apples, the Facebooks, and everything is AI generated and there's no art anymore. I think both of these are a distinct possibility. Which one would you like to be in, would be my question. You don't have to answer that, you can think about it.
Ondřej, have at it. You got the mic.
All right, so my wild prediction is going to be about banners on websites. So who likes cookie banners? No one likes cookie banners, right? But my prediction is that in 10 years, there will be even more banners. And one of the banners will have to ask you if you want to see AI-generated content on a website or not. And if you click no, you will only see human-produced content on a website.
That would be pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll have I don't see that we'll have one open web like we've been used to. I think that we'll have maybe different webs, because if you look at what's already happening, if you look at people going to the web mostly for entertainment and you know, the whole thing about platformization of web and things like that, probably that will continue. I think that you'll have an increasing appetite for more authentic experiences. I think people are already, you can see the analogy with food and processed food and things like that. I think there will be an appetite for something that is more unique, more intimate, and there's going to be sort of a space for that. Then, you know, we'll have government services that need to be sort of treated in a separate way, and we'll have maybe, you know, children's web or something like that, where certain audiences will probably only have access to a certain part of the web. And, you know, when it comes to data, for example, I think as a researcher, there will probably be some sort of paid access to having more, some sort of guarantee that you're accessing authentic, verifiable data, where you know the provenance and everything like that. So I think I was going to, Sebastian, you said something about being optimistic. I also plan to be a bit more optimistic than I normally am normally. And actually, something that Dries said at the end of his keynote yesterday, I think there is something about this possibility of further democratizing access to the web if you remove this requirement of sort of having this technical knowledge. And I think from that point of view, the web has a lot of information, and this is just going to explode, but it's a lot of the same information. And I think there's a glut, right? There's going to be, which with AI-generated content, this is just going to become even more of a just sort of, but it's the same type of information over and over in a way. We still don't know, we cannot go on the web and find out what a person is doing, in terms of using open source to help organic farming in sub-Saharan Africa. There isn't that kind of data available, and I think that there's a hope maybe that we will make the web a bit more interesting again by making this access to becoming a producer more easy and not just as a kind of a consumer. And this is kind of like a nice. The maker-taker, there's always also this kind of conversation around being a consumer versus being a producer of content. So,
Yeah.
Slight optimism.
You already mentioned or repeated what I mentioned in the beginning, so I don't need to repeat that. I still try to be optimistic. In 10 years, services like the ones that we are used to today are run by user cooperatives or organizational cooperatives, are fully auditable, do not maximize for profit, and act in the best interest of the society.
Wait, the question was, is that your prediction?
That's the
Or is that your
prediction
hope?
that you get out of me in the mode Sebastian is trying to be very optimistic.
Okay, yeah. So that's your hope.
That is my hope.
That is
yes.
right. What is your prediction?
My prediction is, given the fact that we are living in a market economy, we might not get that, but that should not keep us from trying to strive for that.
Yes, true. Very true. Yeah. That's true. Well, let's turn it over to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? Please. I think do you want a mic? Oh, yeah, he's going. Yeah. Nico, we have somebody with a question in the audience. Yeah. No, it's fine. I should have given you some warning. Here, we have one. We have two.
Hi. Thanks very much for the talk. So my question is, if the Googles and the Metas of the world have all the money to lobby politicians and the decision-making process, who's holding up the banner for open source right now?
Let me see.
So, there are just, for example, Linux Foundation and Eclipse and OSI have all, in the wake of the CRA, actually employed public policy people that are based now in Brussels. So that's not a huge counterweight. But if you also look broader for like the digital rights organizations, they have long-standing presence in Brussels. And what happens is that for certain issues, you might kind of join forces with those organizations that often have philanthropic or public funding. And sometimes also consumer organizations that in Europe, for example, are also publicly funded. There is often, when it comes to these issues, a kind of possible to have a coalition around open source, digital rights, consumer rights, etc. And then, you should also expect that the policymakers will have the public interest in mind, and even, You're being optimistic, right?
Yeah. And I think what we've heard argued a little bit is that it's up to us, it's up to everybody in this room, right? In the decisions we make in our daily work, right? When I'm working on a piece of code or when I'm helping teams develop policies, right? It's up to us to be the advocates for open source as well. Not just with donating financially to support projects, but with what we do with our time.
Yeah,
Was it?
so
Okay, well, never mind. Yeah, ignore me.
I will try to answer that. But you can influence policy, right? I mean, I'm not sure which country you're in at the moment, but I'm in the UK, and it throws this kind of comment to, if you have complaints, write to your member of parliament. In your country, there might be a different way of doing that, I don't know. And that might not have direct effect, but I will definitely realize that people are interested in these subjects. After a while, maybe after too long, but it is something you can have some influence on. That's the digital rights organizations are very important. I think they are probably your best bet of getting your opinion heard in these conversations around the CRA and other things like that, or privacy-related regulations in whichever country or super country you are in.
I see we've got another question. Oh, yeah.
Just to say that I think actually also the open source community is actually relatively good at mobilizing around certain things. And I have seen, I first got involved with the open source community during the software patents directive discussions. And, compared to other marginalized groups or non-represented groups, I think that there is a power in the in the open source community that not everybody can leverage.
All right.
It's a more remark on the touch point that we have at the beginning, and that is the financing the open source project. And the comment was that corporations should be involved more in financing the libraries. But me as a freelancer, I'm very concerned about that. Because I would like, for example, for your library to get a million donation in amount of 10 euros, rather than one company giving you 10 million euros. And I think that that is very critical, because libraries that we use in open source, their value is much higher than the usage in one company. And one company can influence the decision of the further development of the library. So I need more like a comment on that statement, and is that possible at all to achieve like this democratized financing rather than having corporation financing open source libraries?
What you just said is exactly what I had in mind. My interpretation of the word corporation, that is any business using open source, not just the really big ones. And yes, it is so much better to have lots of contributions from smaller companies in smaller amounts than it is being beholden to one organization, which is a problem that Mozilla now has, right? They get most of the revenue from Alphabet, and that is a very bad situation to be in, especially because Google or Alphabet is going through some regulatory issues at the moment where they might end up not being able to allow to fund Mozilla. And what do they do then? They have nothing, right? And so that is important.
Yeah, it's kind of sad. But I think that we as individuals, developers, we can easily afford to give 10 euros per year to some kind of fund from which the open source projects are going to be financed. And we can keep the control of influencing those project developing. And I think that if we like all chip in for 10 euros per month, per year, that would be enough for all the libraries in the world that we are using often.
And now a hat will be passed around the room.
Did you bring your hat?
I did not. Any other questions in the room? We have time for one more.
There was one actually online. With more standards and regulation being introduced, do you see this as discouraging for smaller companies or individuals getting involved in the open source by increasing time required and risk?
Yes, but also no. It's a point that you made.
I think this is something that it's always going to be an issue, especially with large tenders. And it is also because some of the administration is necessary in order to ensure, a fair process. So I think there are various mechanisms in place, for example, for grants. These Horizon funding of cascading grants, where a consortium will, win a grant to administer further grants. And then normally these are smaller grants that go to smaller projects, and where it's administered by experts, and the application, the burden of the application process is lighter. When it comes to SMEs and bidding for tenders, I think this is something that I think all public authorities are quite aware of, having this sort of, there's this notion that, European SMEs, SMEs are the backbone of the European economy, etc. I think policymakers want to make it easier for SMEs to participate. I think there are ways to also use like procurement hubs, for example. There is a business model for companies to help put together competitive bids by bundling, services, that can be provided by SMEs to be able to compete with bigger companies that can provide everything in-house. And so it's always going to be tricky to compete with large, companies. But I think at the same time, there is a willingness to try to support SMEs and smaller projects, etc. And so it's also about finding, there is maybe some kind of also responsibility to try to seek out those grants, because what you see, I'm involved in quite a few grants, and you do see that it's often the same usual suspects that have sort of figured out that this exists, and you'll see some people going for, and then you'll have worthy projects that maybe never get funded, but you have to ask. You have to ask for funding to get the funding. That's the kind of minimum requirement.
The point that I was referring to that you are making is more on the requirement for implementation of all these regulations. Not what I heard, but that's okay. Does not matter. Also, good point. But it's a point about the implementation of all these laws, because the policy intent is always going to be focused on the larger corporations, or the organizations that look in the eyes of the regulator to be more of a problem. And that tends to be the larger corporations. Whereas as smaller projects, you're not going to be on the radar of the regulator for a long, long time anyway, until something bad happens, obviously.
By the way, that's one of the arguments for saying that regulation, even though it's often fought by the big companies, they fight against it, it benefits the bigger companies, right? And so I think this is an unfortunate situation. Yeah. I don't think that was the question.
Okay, then I don't know either.
But for some certain things, there is also an intent for SMEs, for example, to have a lighter regulatory burden, and these things exist. But I think when it comes to, for example, cybersecurity requirements, that's not necessarily, how can I say, if you are under a lighter regulatory regime, from the client's perspective, that's not going to help you, because they will be looking for the most secure, right? So that we don't want to get into a situation where, to some extent, I think that even that applies also for open source SMEs. If the burden of is lighter, the regulatory burden, we will also not be, necessarily competitive.
Trying to end on a funny note, coming back to what Ondřej said earlier with the banner. I mean, it's really easy to comply with the cookie directive or whatever it's called. Just don't use cookies. Then you don't need the banner, then you don't need to implement it. You also want to be funny.
I'm definitely not funny.
You have 12 seconds.
Oh. Somebody asked me, like, all these big corporations, they can just implement all the cookie banners. How can you do this as a small organization and say, well, this is really easy. This hasn't cost me any time whatsoever because I don't do silly things like that. So I don't need these banners.
Sure.
Yeah, I know, but I was trying.
Well, thank you. Everybody, thank our panel. Please join the thank panel. Great. We're done. Okay. We're finished. We are finished. If you have any questions, you can find them around the conference. You hunt them down. They'll be here.